Alexa, open BraveWords Radio.
Welcome back to BraveWords Radio. Brought to you by Vox Protocol, the global leader in voice app entertainment. BraveWords Radio is an awesome musical extension of BraveWords.com, where we have been waving the flag of hard rock and heavy metal around the world for over 30 years. Since you have been here before, we hope you enjoy BraveWords Radio.
So please, this is a real big honor. I'm a huge fan. Please welcome to BraveWords Streaming For Vengeance, Mr. Tom Warrior of Celtic Frost, Triptychon. We might as well throw Hellhammer fame in there. Thank you so much for joining me this week. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Just coming from an Opeth concert, so the mood is very good.
Excellent, excellent. Say hi to Mike for me.
I shall.
Tell me about Danse. I get to call it Macabre because it's British English, right? And not macabre. How do you prefer to call it?
British English is just fine for me.
Okay. Please tell me about the proud moment looking at your career in a box set. It's, my God, this massive piece of work. It looks so amazing.
Well, you know, you're probably familiar with Celtic Frost's history and Hellhammer's history, and we began as a garage underground band with like no following whatsoever, except for a handful of friends. So being here 40 odd years later and seeing this box set released is of course hugely astonishing for me, because I remember the early days very well, and nobody would have ever thought that the band would exist, that the band would go out into the world, that the band would do multiple albums, that the band would find an audience, much less that people would still talk about the band after 40 years. And here we are. And I feel hugely honored, I feel astonished about this. And to me, it's also not just a memory to Celtic Frost and to me, but it's also a memory to Martin.
Right. Now, it's funny because we see a couple of press releases and then this box set arrives and it's 10 pounds, and it must have taken years of work to put this thing together, and it's all in secrecy for the most part, right?
Well, it took close to a year of work. And that seems short compared to what you just said, but the sound of the records in the box set is of course based on the 2017 reissues that we also did with BMG, which saved us a lot of work. Everybody involved with the 2017 reissues had the feeling that these are the best sounding Celtic Frost releases ever. We took great care in remastering those reissues at the time, appropriately, respectfully, but also to the standards of modern listening devices. And we were very happy with the outcome. So when we did this box set, or when BMG approached me to do this box, I have to say, because they own all the rights in the music. So when BMG approached me and they said, let's base it on the 2017 reissues, at least half of the work was already done, and we could actually focus on the contents of the box set itself.
Now, it's an incredible archive. Describe the vault of Celtic Frost and your storage practices over time. Where has this stuff been hiding, and how?
Well, as I said, we signed very unfavorable contracts in the early 1980s because we didn't know any better. We were very young. We had no experience whatsoever. Switzerland also didn't have an extreme metal scene or much of a music scene where we could have asked any peers or contacted a music lawyer. So we signed these contracts and unknowingly signed away the rights to our early music. So the vault is actually not ours. It was Noise Records' vault.
Right.
That later, when Noise Records folded 20 years ago, they transferred to Universal and then to BMG. But I was actually at Noise Records before they folded in 1999 in Berlin, and I went to their archive, and I was shocked, but not necessarily surprised to discover that most of it had been thrown away over the years. Not just ours, but the irreplaceable material by other bands too that they had signed. They never looked at us bands at the time as a long-term thing. They thought these bands are never going to last. We're going to make money with 2 or 3 albums. They actually told me this in the 80s.
Wow.
And this is also why they didn't take care in preserving like photos, original photos for which there are no negatives, original concepts, memos, letters, also actual master tapes. Most of it is actually gone. So the vault that you're asking me about is unfortunately very thin. And that's not a fault of the band. It's because of the lack of care by what was then the record company. Luckily nowadays BMG is a different caliber of record company, and I have the feeling, even though we don't own the rights, they're in good hands.
Now that shows back at the time a very severe lack of foresight, because it is so much catalog these days. It's not a metal thing, it's an everything. Every band, every label is just dumping catalog, and shockingly on vinyl.
No, nobody is more surprised by this than I am.
Right?
But I love it, of course. I mean, I'm like everybody else. I listen to my music mostly electronically. But I have to say, I'm also a collector, and I love to unfold a gatefold album and read the lyrics or read the credits while I'm listening to the music on my device. There's nothing that beats vinyl as far as presentation is concerned, and room for artwork and room for information.
When did you actually, as a band, start saving and taping everything? And how do you feel with the current technology, whether it be your phone or whatever, how easy it is to tape a riff or a vocal line? But looking back, did you get to a point where we need to record everything, no matter what it sounds like?
Well, unfortunately, that basically only started when we reformed the band in 2001. When we had our own devices, when we had our own record company, and we had full control of everything. We would have loved to record more things in the 1980s. For example, do demos for albums like To Mega Therion or Into the Pandemonium, but there was simply no budget. The record company always asked us for demos, but when we said we have no money, we're an underground band, could you finance the demos? They said no.
Right.
And of course, if you look at, for example, Into the Pandemonium, you can't just go to the studio and do a demo. I mean, there's classical musicians involved and everything. So it was completely out of reach for us as a band before our breakthrough to record any of this with our own funds. We were lucky if we could buy enough equipment to go on the road and things like that.
Right.
And also, we're talking about the time before cell phone cameras and so on. None of us owned a camera, believe it or not. We were really a low-budget operation in the beginning, really underground. And of course, now everybody wishes we had more photos, we had more recordings, but the reality was just too dreary. We really were underdogs in the beginning, and this is the result of it.
What are the limitations of being from Switzerland? And I find a few similarities to being to Canada. I know we're very close to the US, but it's a different beast. So being alone in the darkness, I can relate growing up alone in the darkness, in the cold.
Well, yeah, but I have to say, the comparison with Canada, we really followed the Canadian hard rock and metal scene at the time. Bands like Godot and Triumph, and I mean, there was so many.
Rush.
Exciter, Rush, well, Rush obviously, and so on. But there was a million.
Yeah.
And we looked up to that scene. That scene was highly developed in our minds compared to what we had in Switzerland. Here in Switzerland, there was a handful of bands that tried to copy Crocus, because Crocus were the first band to do any business outside of Switzerland. But that was really the end of it, and which made it very difficult for us to find musicians to play extreme metal. But if you ask me what was the drawbacks or the advantages of Switzerland, back then we thought it was all drawbacks. We felt we were isolated, and like I said earlier, we didn't have any peers we could talk to, gain experience from. Nowadays, I think being forced to rely on our own ideas and basically having to create everything from scratch the way we imagined it is being done actually made us sound like nobody else. So nowadays, in latter days, Martin and I always looked at it as an advantage, but back then we perceived it as a severe hindrance.
Now, from what I've read, it was your mom's music collection that was part of the inspiration. Like, where else were you hearing music and finding music?
Well, that's what started it all when I was a child. My parents' music collection that was divided when they got divorced when I was 6. My mother's part was a very eclectic mixture of anything from country to swing. And that really inspired me to go look when I was old enough to dare to go into the big city alone and enter the record stores and which was quite intimidating at the time. In the 1970s, record store customers looked very different than nowadays. They were like Hell's Angels and people like that, or drug users. And for a little guy from a farm village, it was quite intimidating in my little jeans jacket to stand among them. But I was so drawn to the music that I ventured to those record stores and started discovering my own music. And of course, back then with vinyl, you could go to the sales desk and listen to the albums. They had stereos, and you could put on the vinyl and test listen it.
Right.
And that's pretty much standing there listening to albums that looked interesting. This is how me and Martin discovered the music of the world.
And that's my history. I don't know if you recall when I was working at HMV for 15 years. That's from the in-store, 2006. Remember that?
Right. It's
where we actually had
absolutely.
a listening bar too, so you could actually listen to music. But really, looking back, what really first stirred you? What was like the first sounds that were like, whoa, this is what I want to pursue. This is really scaring me or fulfilling me.
Well, if you really go to the very beginning, when I was around 10 years old, I saw on Swiss TV had every week on Saturday they had a music show where they showed all kinds of clips. And one of the clips was Suzi Quatro 48 Crash, which for 1973 was quite a heavy song. It was definitely hard rock. And I was completely blown away by the way the band looked. They looked all fucked up and dark. And for some reason, I felt totally attracted to that. And Suzi Quatro was so powerful that I asked my mother to buy me that album for my 10th birthday, and I got it. And this album was really, as strange as it sounds when you know my later music, but this album was really the beginning.
Wow.
Songs like Glycerine Queen or Primitive Love. It's actually material that I still listen to.
Do you still own that record?
Absolutely.
I love that answer.
Absolutely.
I love that answer.
Absolutely.
I was reading recently Keith Richards' biography, and the first Rolling Stones record was virtually all covers. And then the second one, he looked at Mick and said, we got to try to write a song. So the second one actually has original songs. Do you remember the first time you actually wrote a song, and what did it feel like?
Well, if you look at early Hellhammer, it's basically all covers too, but we could hardly play. So it was badly executed covers disguised as our own songs. I think we really came into our own towards the end of Hellhammer. You know, in the second year of Hellhammer's existence, that's when we really started attempting to write real songs, real original songs. It's a transition that most bands do, and of course you're lucky if you don't record your first material and it remains hidden forever. In Hellhammer's case, we recorded a lot of these early songs, for better or for worse. Some of them have become quite cult-like. Some of them are rather embarrassing, but I guess that's goes with every band.
It's all part of your wonderful history. Describe the bunker. What artwork did you have on this, your workspace? What tell me about it. Was there a bar?
No, there wasn't a bar because most of us actually didn't drink, believe it or not. The bunker was a nuclear a protection bunker because the band was, of course, formed in the middle of the Cold War when nuclear war seemed basically inevitable. So the Swiss law said that every building has to have a nuclear bunker underneath.
Wow.
And we were lucky to rent from the village the bunker that was underneath the kindergarten. and it was just concrete. It was impossible to even talk inside. It was so reflective. The audio was reflective of the walls to an extent that you could not even speak.
Right.
So we put egg cartons. The cartons where the eggs were delivered. We got empty egg cartons and glued them to the wall. So there was no room for artwork. Like every square foot was covered with these egg cartons. But we took a spray can and graffiti-like sprayed the names of our favorite bands onto the egg cartons. You can see it in some of the photos. There's Venom and Tank and Discharge, stuff like that. The bands that basically shaped Hellhammer.
What, just to bring up a somber point, because it really, these two deaths really sent shockwaves, just the loss of your two allies, Giger and Martin. What do you miss most from both of these gentlemen?
Well, I miss the frequent exchanges with them, the intellectual exchanges with them. Martin only became a songwriter on the last Celtic Frost album. Before that, Martin's role was basically as an advisor, as a consultant, and in that he became very important, almost as important as if he would have written music. And that's exactly what I miss. Discussing music with him, discussing creativity with him, discussing concepts with him, ideas. And sometimes he had an extremely cross and radical approach, like me too, but a different one. Mm-hmm. And these different approaches made for very interesting conversations. And sometimes you had to really be open and prepared to allow each other's viewpoint and learn from it. And that's really what I miss about him. And with Giger, it's of course much the same. Giger, when he was still health-wise in a good place, Giger had a lot of knowledge about occultism, about art, and he was a highly interesting person. I'm saying this because, of course, the music and the art remains. That's not what I'm missing. I'm missing the actual exchange with the person.
Yeah. That's quite sad. I'm sorry for you.
Well, it happens to all of us, and
yes,
you and I will also one day disappear from this planet. It's a natural course of thing. I would have hoped Martin would have lived longer, of course, but it is as it is.
Well, it sounded like a really bold move for you guys to contact Giger way back in the day. Like that did that take balls?
It sounds like a bold move, but it wasn't, because we had nothing to lose. We were nobodies. We had no record deal at the time. We were an unknown band in a wet, mildewing bunker with two demos, Death Fiend and Triumph of Death, and it didn't take guts. What did we have to lose? I mean, we might as well try, because it cannot get any worse. I mean, we have no contacts. Nobody likes our music, so we might as well try. Can't get worse.
And he was a struggling artist as well because of the darkness, correct?
He had been, not at the time we contacted him, but he had been in the 60s and up to the mid 70s. He was in the underground too, for much the same reason, because his art was dark and shunned, and people said, you cannot do this is too extreme, just like they did with Hellhammer's music. And he later told me that's exactly where he bonded with us. He was more of a jazz fan. He listened to rock music, but he was more of a jazz fan.
Right.
But where he found a connection to Hellhammer and later Celtic Frost was that we pursued a similar path, and what we created had a similar aura, so to speak.
Arguably, people say that the artwork for Mega Therion is one of the greatest, not just for the art itself, but in metal history. Explain how you got the rights and acquired it. Did you have to pay money, or what was the deal?
Well, Martin and I poured over Giger's Necronomicon, his oversized standard work, constantly. It was basically our Bible. We looked at it literally every day. And we of course, we loved the Satan 1 painting. And when we wrote to him in late 83, when I wrote to him my little letter, handwritten letter, we mentioned that painting and said, if it's at all possible, would it be possible to collaborate with this painting? And to our astonishment, he actually responded. He called us, and then his wife also called us, who did his administration at the time. And we began to have regular phone calls. We began to have regular letter exchanges. It was, of course, before the email and so on.
Right.
And he told me on the phone one day that he had just finished what he called the Red Face, a series of paintings in red paint. And he said his favorite painting of that series is the only one that hasn't been published yet. And he said, if you agree to also use that red painting that I love so much and put it also on the album, I give you Satan 1 for free.
Wow.
And of course, for us being total nobodies and not even having been sure if he would even talk about Satan 1, for us, the offer of 2 Giger paintings was jaw-dropping. Of course, we said yes, and it was an honor for us to also publish the red painting Victory. And the big obstacle to this was to talk the record company into financing a gatefold album so we could have both artwork.
Wow, that must have been a huge battle.
It was, because there again, the record company didn't really realize that this was a sensation, that Giger was actually collaborating with this little Swiss band. But we managed to convince them, and the rest is history, I guess.
That's amazing. That's amazing. How do you think the catalog has aged over time? And when you were creating it, and this is a very general question, did you feel like you were creating something special?
Look, we didn't look at it so globally. We looked at it much more privately, much more intimately. We didn't create to make an impact. We created because we had something inside of us that screamed to be let out, probably based on the conditions of our upbringing, of our youth. Both Martin and I, and also Steve Warrior, with whom I formed Hellhammer, we all had quite a difficult youth. And I think the music we created is a reflection of that. So it was. We didn't want to leave an impression. We really, first and foremost, it was a very personal thing. What it achieved afterwards is, of course, out of our hands. And I'm hugely grateful for having found an audience, and the audience being true to me for such a long time. That's a gargantuan gift. As for your question about how the catalog has aged, well, Celtic Frost was a very ambitious, courageous, and daring band, and we did a lot of experiments. Some of those worked and have aged quite well. Some of those failed miserably and have aged accordingly. But that comes with the territory. If you try to reinvent yourself on every album, you're bound to sometimes hit a wall. Not that that's an excuse. We should have been more diligent, I guess, in some of the albums, especially me, but live and learn. I think the first 3 albums, Morbid Tales to Mega Therion, Into Pandemonium, have aged very well, and the last one, Monotheist, so far has also aged very well. The others, there's an album that is unbearably bad, and there's an album that's basically irrelevant. It's okay, but it's irrelevant in the catalog.
Right.
That's my personal view of it.
You kind of answered my next question, because were you paying attention to the other extreme pockets around the world? And you surprised me, because, dude, I grew up on Gatto and Rush and Triumph and Max Webster. But were you paying attention to the Big Four, or even what was happening in Canada as well, with Anvil, Razor, and Exciter, and other pockets in Germany?
I loved Anvil from the first album. I absolutely worshipped Anvil. And Gatto was one of my, or still is one of my favorite Canadian bands. I still listen to Gatto all the time. Yeah, of course we paid attention to it. Maybe not the Big Four; they weren't titled like that, and we viewed the order quite differently than it's perceived nowadays. To us, one of the most important bands of the thrash metal movement, for example, was Exciter. The first album by Exciter, for example, changed our lives. It was absolutely amazing, and I still worship it to this day.
And you inspired some kid in Southern Ontario to start a magazine called BraveWords and Bloody Knuckles. So thank you. How does it feel when you meet people that were like, you changed my life? Because you know what really changed my life was watching the videos, like Circle of the Tyrants, you know what I mean? And Venom was another great example, because they had Witching Hour, they had Die Hard, you know what I mean? And finally, when MTV in Canada was Much Music, we got to see this stuff. And it's like, whoa, you know what I mean? And that just changed everything.
Exactly, and it had quite a magical aura to it because back then videos weren't just available like today. You really had to go look for videos. Some friends maybe had a bootleg or a bad VHS copy, or if you were lucky, some TV station would play one or two metal videos occasionally. It was very rare, and like you just described it. I mean, there was much material that changed our lives too. I mean, beginning with the obvious, some of Black Sabbath's material changed our lives completely forever, and then Angel Witch or Venom or Discharge, and like I said, Exciter, for example, or receiving the first Megadeth demo through tape trading and hearing how they're pushing the technical envelope in North America was an eye opener to us, and so on.
You've mentioned Crocus a couple of times. Were you ever a fan of Headhunter?
No.
Okay.
No, the only album by Crocus that I still think is quite fantastic, and I have to say this in hindsight because nowadays it's probably no longer so innovative. But when it came out in whatever it was, 1980, 81, Metal Rendezvous was quite a strong hard rock album. And I actually also went to see that tour, and Crocus were phenomenal on stage at the time. Unfortunately, they lost a bit of that spark later on, and they had 10 million lineup changes, which is a shame because when I saw them back then, they were maybe not an original band because they sounded very much like AC/DC, but they had the spark, so it actually worked.
Right, right. Now we're talking to a struggling musician way back when. How did it feel to get that Swiss Music Prize?
For risk of sounding completely detached and arrogant, it no longer mattered. There was a lot of struggling in Hellhammer's and Celtic Frost's career, and I'm not lamenting that. I think it's actually something that you need to go through. Every band should go through that. It makes you more mature, and you learn through the struggle. So I'm not lamenting that. But there was a lot of struggle, and we could have used some encouragement from our own country at the time. But receiving the Swiss Music Prize 40 years into my career and having become one of Switzerland's most prolific rock musician, I no longer need this. Now it's almost like a bad joke, and I actually, for a very long time, I had decided not to accept it. But the people around me, such as my girlfriend and so on, prevailed and said you should accept it. It's still an honor, so I did accept it. But I'm afraid it didn't really mean so much to me.
Right. I understand. It's kind of like the bands that are getting into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 40 years after they should have been in. Kind of.
I tell you what means something to me. Much more than any fucking prize by a fucking government. What means something to me is that there are audience members who listen to my music, come to my concerts, have given to me the gift of living the dream I had as a young musician, as a young teenager, and coming from Switzerland without a scene, without rich parents, without connections. This dream seemed completely impossible, and yet it was people in our audience who made this possible. And people come up to me frequently and say, "I've been listening to music for 40 years." That is the prize that matters, you know.
Right.
You know, it's not the Swiss government who has shaped me and made my career possible. It's the fans of my music, just like I'm a fan of millions of other bands, and that's really what matters. And you know you can appreciate this without any music prize.
If it wasn't for music, what would you be doing?
Oh Jesus, I have no idea. I originally was on the path to becoming an aircraft mechanic. I studied to be a mechanic with the final goal to be an aircraft mechanic. But then I became frustrated as I was in my apprenticeship because it was all tool machines and formulae and so on. And I wanted to be more creative. And my mother sensed catastrophe looming. So she said, "Why don't you become a goldsmith? There you can be a mechanic and creative at the same time." And she really tried to talk me into this. Then I got the offer for a record deal. And of course, I took the offer. So I really don't know if I would be an aircraft mechanic now or a goldsmith or dead or a criminal. I don't know. God knows.
A gravedigger, maybe. Right? What was a couple more quickies if you don't mind? Was there an artist that was truly honored to meet you that just floored you, and vice versa? Someone that you've met that was like, whoa, you had to pick yourself up off the floor.
Well, I've met many people who've been very important to me personally in my own path, such as Tony Iommi or Kevin Hayburn of Angel Witch, without whom I wouldn't be here. And of course, you sometimes, even a person like me, is at the loss for words in such a moment. I said it elsewhere in an interview recently. I became a really pathetic little fan when Tony Iommi was standing in front of me unexpectedly at an award show. Out of the blue, he was standing in front of me, and I was like, I was the most pathetic little kindergarten fan. As 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 for people the other way around, it would sound really pretentious if I would list people. Yeah. There are people that I look up to for their own work who claim that they were influenced by me, but I look at their work and I have to say, well, your music is a million times better than mine. How can this be?
Yeah.
So to me, it seems very far fetched, you know.
What are the roots of the name Warrior? And please don't take that as a dumb question.
No. Well, Steve Warrior and I, the night we formed Hellhammer, we of course were worshippers of Discharge and Venom and Motorhead, and we felt our little Swiss last names just they wouldn't cut it if you would play such extreme music. We felt they were anachronistic with this music. So we thought we need to have some extreme last name. And Steve Warrior, in his apprenticeship as a technical draftsman, he went to school with a guy called Krieger, and Krieger is the German word for warrior. And we thought this is the coolest last name ever. So we basically hijacked that guy's last name, translated it to English, and became the Warriors. And then, of course, none of us knew that one of us would still have that name like 43 years later.
That's an amazing story. Two more for you. Blackie from Wasp had a really poignant quote last week because he's doing all these Q&A things with Wasp's 40th anniversary tour. He says, an artist never gets to hear the final album like a fan. And that really took me back. And it makes a lot of sense. What do you think about that?
You never get to hear any of your music or any of your concerts like the audience does. That comes with the territory, but of course, sometimes you wish you could, but I think it's a fair price to pay for the opportunities you're given, or the opportunities that the audience is giving you. But yeah, of course, it would be interesting to hear things from a different perspective. It probably would be very enlightening.
Last question, and I hope I can attend. It's great to see the Sweden's Time to Rock Festival. That's going to be a big undertaking for you next July.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. It's a first for me, and we also debated for a while in Triptychon whether we want to do this. We don't want to be a Celtic Frost tribute band, but of course we also represent Celtic Frost legacy. And we all think it's worthwhile because we all love this music, and it has everybody in our band is shaped by it from one way or another. So it's also a revisiting of our own roots, and that's why we agreed to do it. I'm actually looking forward very much to it. The organizer of the festival is so far in our exchanges is an extremely interesting and intelligent person, and it's an honor to do this for him.
From my guess, there's more attention to bands like yourself than ever. And watching Merciful Fate perform just sold out shows, that must be somewhere in your head bringing something back on the road. Like, it's good for King.
Absolutely. I think they deserve it. Absolutely. There's no question to it. And of course, it reminds me of the Celtic Frost, the return of Celtic Frost. the astonishing thing is that there is still an audience for this music, and that now the next generation, or even the generation after the next generation, are still listening to this music that is the root of today's metal. I think that's absolutely fantastic, and it's an honor to be part of that generation and still be granted to go on stage and perform this music, be it us or King or the others from my generation.
Even Pantera, BraveWords is we're working with the Monterey Metal Fest, and this whole Pantera rollout with the two brothers missing. But I always say we will always see generations come and go, but it's a new release if you've never heard it before, whether it be Who's Next or to Mega Therion, in my opinion, right? Or Back in Black, whatever.
Absolutely. And I mean, you and I are all from a generation. I mean, when I was a teenager, the first few Black Sabbath albums have been created, and I wasn't aware of it. So I too had to go back and discover music that already existed. And for me, it was brand new, and it still shaped me.
Thank you so much.